How do you become the leader of one of the most powerful drug trafficking empires in American history? Escape with the equivalent of over $100 million in today's money and vanish without leaving a single trace? I believe only Frank Matthews knows that answer. Ranked by the DEA among the top 10 drug traffickers in United States history, Frank Matthews lived an extraordinary life, yet surprisingly few people are familiar with his name. Operating from Brooklyn during the 1960s and 70s, this young African-American kingpin in his 20s controlled one of the most formidable criminal organizations the world has ever witnessed. His wealth was estimated at $300 million, equivalent to roughly $2 billion in today's currency. An astronomical fortune built through heroin and cocaine distribution across the entire eastern seaboard of the United States. A trafficking network that operated completely independent of mafia influence, which was exceptionally uncommon for an African-American gangster and, frankly, for any American criminal at that time. By breaking free from mafia control, Frank Matthews had surpassed his predecessor, Bumpy Johnson, and even accumulated more wealth than Frank Lucas, the heroin dealer immortalized in the film American Gangster. Yet strangely, most people have never heard his story. Perhaps Hollywood didn't want to glorify a criminal who successfully beat the system, because imagine a gangster film where the protagonist escapes with all the money at the end. That's precisely what Frank Matthews accomplished, despite being scheduled to appear in court, vanishing off the face of the planet just like that, with his girlfriend and over $100 million in cash. A completely bizarre and mysterious conclusion to a criminal empire. In essence, an enigmatic gangster who absolutely deserves to have his story shared. So prepare yourself to explore the most fascinating unsolved mystery of recent decades.
He had been identified as one of the largest, if not the largest heroin trafficker in the United States.
He was in a league of his own, and he was not only an organizer, but a businessman. There's been a lot of recent movies on Lucas being the king of drugs. That's not true. Matthews was the #1 heroin pioneer. I'd say he was definitely smarter than Frank Lucas. Where he is today, God only knows.
I think he's alive, and I say this unequivocally because he's a smart person.
All of the agents who worked on the case to this day believe he's still alive.
The mysterious beginnings. The life of Frank Matthews is, how should I describe it, an absolute enigma. But what's even more puzzling is his early life, about which we genuinely know very little. The explanation is simple: the numerous contradictory stories from people who claim they knew him. Ricky Johnson, a Durham native, the North Carolina city where Frank Matthews originated, explains.
You hear countless stories about Frank Matthews. It's difficult to separate fact from fiction. Everyone has a different account of growing up with him. You quickly realize much of what you hear is nothing more than rumor.
Another Durham resident confirms this sentiment.
Many people enjoy fabricating stories so they can share the spotlight. They claim they worked with Frank, sold drugs for him, but then you discover they're younger than Matthews and not from the same generation. They simply want to be connected to the legend.
As for those who genuinely knew him, well, they typically refuse to discuss it. As this Durham native who claims to have known Frank explains, you won't get people from here to speak openly about Frank. They either suspect you're with law enforcement or they worry they might say something that could return to haunt them. People here are careful. Many believe Frank Matthews is still alive. You never know who might be listening or what information could reach him. So it's not simple to construct a complete picture of Frank's youth. However, there are certain facts we can establish about his formative years. Frank Larry Matthews comes from Durham, North Carolina. He was born there on February 13th, 1944. Into a family he barely experienced. We know virtually nothing about his father. Regarding his mother, she passed away when he was only 4 years old. From that point forward, young Matthews was raised by his aunt, who accepted him and raised him as her own child. He lived in the most impoverished neighborhood of Durham, a city famous at that time for hosting one of the most affluent black communities in the nation, despite the segregation that existed. A Durham native and friend of Matthews remembers, during the segregation era, Durham had everything a black person could desire. We had substantial black wealth per capita. we had more black millionaires than any other city in North Carolina. The environment of this period gave young blacks the motivation to strive for achievement, which I'm certain Frank was influenced by, undoubtedly inspired by all the successful black entrepreneurs in Durham. Al Bradley, an author who has written extensively about Frank's life, observes,
Matthews must have witnessed numerous black-owned businesses and successful black men during his childhood. That later provided him the confidence to bypass the Italian mafia in the drug business. That was unprecedented at the time. Something in Matthews' upbringing gave him the boldness to walk fearlessly into a world that didn't respect him.
Frank established his presence from a young age, particularly with his classmates and the children in his neighborhood. He appears to be a natural leader whom peers his age wanted to follow. People who knew him as a youth consistently used the same two descriptions: strong and charismatic, qualities that would eventually enable Frank to compete with New York's most dangerous gangsters. At school, however, the situation was completely different. Frank lacked commitment and appeared uninterested in his education. What he preferred was being on the streets, an environment where he thrived like a fish in water. Naturally, he abandoned school at a young age. All he cared about was earning money. As one of his childhood friends remembers, even back then, he was completely focused on money. Frank was a hustler. Frank Matthews could also be kind to those close to him. However, you didn't want to cross him because he could become violent. As another of his associates notes, Frank was a natural who would fight anyone over anything. He could, however, be distant and guarded. As this other friend discloses, people boasted that they knew Frank, but they didn't truly know him. You could never really get close to Frank. As a teenager, he led a gang involved in various minor crimes, including stealing chickens from a local farm, which resulted in his arrest at age 14. He subsequently enrolled in a hairdressing school, but only remained there a few months. According to a Durham native, this was because Frank had been caught stealing barber's equipment. But the source also mentions, not long after that, I encountered Matthews on Fayetteville Street. He told me he was heading to New York to make money. Frank departed his hometown of Durham in the early 60s to pursue his fortune. Still a teenager, he set off to chase his dreams of wealth by traveling northeast, initially to Philadelphia. He remained there approximately 1 year. During this period, he worked as a barber and numbers collector for an illegal lottery operation. Through this illegal enterprise, which was common at the time, Frank encountered other ambitious young people who, like him, were seeking to earn money. But as mentioned, Frank didn't remain long in Philadelphia. And in 1963, or possibly 1964, he departed for New York. A predictable decision for Roger Garay, a police detective who had investigated him.
New York is a city of opportunity for an ambitious gangster, as well as for those who want to earn an honest living.
Building an empire. Frank relocated to Brooklyn and continued doing what he had been doing in Philadelphia, working as a hairdresser while organizing illegal gambling. He maintained this activity for some time before growing tired of the numbers racket and transitioning to a more lucrative business, drug dealing. Frank quickly noticed that the black drug dealers in his neighborhood were making substantial profits, so it didn't take long for him to decide to join them. As Inspector Roger Garay notes,
I think Frank woke up one morning and decided to abandon the barber's white jacket. Frank told himself, I'm going to be the man who wears the $300 silk suits and drives the Lincoln.
During the 60s and 70s, an illegal substance spread massively throughout New York: heroin. At the time, the drug was generating a genuine epidemic, fueling violence and chaos in the black community. A situation that one of the city's former police officers recalls.
The year following King's assassination, we had over 2,000 homicides in New York. The majority occurred in Harlem, and I'd estimate about 85% were drug-related. It became so severe that if an officer working in Harlem issued someone a ticket for double parking, it could easily escalate to a small riot. That's how unstable Harlem was in the late 1960s. Drug dealers like Frank Matthews and Nicky Barnes became heroes because people viewed them as challenging a system that wasn't working.
Frank capitalized on the situation and entered the thriving drug trade. He had no alternative but to establish contact with the criminal organization that controlled the supply and distribution of heroin throughout New York, the Great Cosa Nostra. Dealing with the mafia. In the 1960s, the drug trade on the US East Coast, particularly in black communities, was dominated by New York's 5 major mafia families: the Gambinos, the Luccheses, the Bonanos, the Genoveses, formerly Luciano, and the Colombos, formerly Profaci. For a period, the trade was controlled by Jewish gangsters, notably Arnold Rothstein, an organized crime figure who, as early as the 1920s, understood the profitable potential of this illegal trade, helping to organize and expand it in America. Then, in the 1930s, the Italian mafia, seeking to diversify after Prohibition, partnered with the Jewish underworld in drug trafficking before monopolizing the market in the subsequent decade. After World War II, heroin trafficked by the mafia was imported from Italian refineries. These refineries shut down after the Italian government decided to prohibit heroin manufacturing in the early 50s. Without options, the mafia searched for alternative sources of supply. And this is where the French Connection emerged, with the establishment of an even more sophisticated smuggling network where opium was cultivated in Turkey, then transported to France for processing in clandestine laboratories, and finally distributed throughout the United States. This network, which flourished in the 50s and 60s, allowed the American mafia to continue trafficking drugs in the United States and New York. To enter this market and begin selling his first kilograms of heroin, Frank Matthews had to work through the Cosa Nostra. He attempted this by trying to establish a partnership with the Gambino and Bonanno families, but for whatever reason, they rejected him. Many would have been discouraged by this rejection, but not Frank. He was young, ambitious, and determined to establish himself in the drug business. So he persisted until he discovered another opportunity. An opportunity that came through Spanish Raymond Marquez, an acquaintance of Frank's known at the time as the king of the underground lottery in Harlem. He had connections which he shared with Frank, introducing him to a Cuban gangster named Rolando Gonzalez Nunez, a major cocaine supplier who in the 1960s was among the biggest cocaine dealers in New York before fleeing to Venezuela due to legal troubles. Frank connects with Rolando and the agreement is finalized. He purchases his first kilogram of cocaine for $20,000. The relationship quickly evolved into a drug trafficking network. The Cuban trafficker regularly shipped him large quantities of cocaine and heroin from South America, and Frank expanded his operation by reselling the product in New York. And it didn't take him long to establish himself, becoming one of the city's major drug dealers in just 1 year. At that time, Venezuela was one of the Latin American countries where the Cosa Nostra was established for drug trafficking. It was a strategic location, especially due to its geographical proximity to the United States. An ideal base, which the French Connection utilized to transport its heroin to Latin America and distribute it to Miami, one of the primary entry points to the United States for drug trafficking. The Corsicans, with their capacity to infiltrate and corrupt governments, were responsible for transporting the drugs to Venezuela. Then, the Cubans would ship the heroin to the United States before it was distributed nationwide, including New York, where Frank, through his collaboration with the French Connection and the Cubans, had become one of the city's largest dealers. Ultimately, Frank was the complete opposite of La Cosa Nostra, who sold their drugs at excessive prices with no concern for product quality. And so it wasn't long before his network expanded even further, supplying drugs to nearly 21 different states, particularly on the East Coast of the United States. It never reached California, but given time, it certainly could have dominated the entire country. As U.S. federal prosecutor William Callahan reports,
If Matthews hadn't been stopped as he was in 1972, he would have eventually controlled the national scene, and then he would have become a truly international kingpin. I think Matthews was so ambitious that could have been his ultimate goal.
Frank Matthews' profits from heroin and cocaine trafficking were staggering. It's said that he earned up to $600,000 daily and that his fortune approached $300 million, equivalent to $2 billion today. A fortune he accumulated in just 4 years. According to Liddy Jones, a former associate of Frank's,
No gangster in New York at the time earned more money than him. The Italian mafia made substantial money, but they couldn't match Frank. He had more money than the mob.
Liddy Jones then shares this anecdote from the early 70s.
I had a good friend who said she knew somebody in Brooklyn who could supply me all the heroin I needed. My friend was close with an associate of Frank. I requested 5 keys and received it for $22,000 per key. I started making really good money from my connection to Frank Matthews. I discovered I wasn't anything special. All the top drug dealers along the East Coast were obtaining their drugs from Frank. It was remarkable to deal with him. He never actually counted the money. You could have shortchanged him thousands of dollars and Frank wouldn't have noticed.
5 years after his arrival in New York, Frank Matthews had become the biggest drug kingpin in the city. Even though he was barely in his 20s, he had established his own drug trafficking network completely independent of the mafia, which was quite an achievement for an African-American gangster. The Summits.
It's remarkable to observe what he accomplished as a self-made man and how he built a criminal empire independently. I think the only people in organized crime history comparable to Matthews are Lucky Luciano and Pablo Escobar.
Frank can indeed be compared to Luciano and Escobar in the sense that, like them, he was the organizer and coordinator of summits between kingpins. One in Atlanta in October 1971, during which he invited the country's biggest African-American and Hispanic drug traffickers with the objective of improving the distribution of heroin and cocaine. And the other in Las Vegas the following year during the fight between Muhammad Ali and Jerry Quarry, a meeting where similar topics were discussed, such as the necessity to establish stronger independent relationships with the Corsican and Cuban mafia to liberate themselves from the control of the Italian-American mafia. An American anti-drug agent recalls,
When we started checking the license plates and the intelligence on who was in attendance, we could see it was a gathering of the who's who of black organized crime. Matthews was the reason they came. At the time, he truly was the country's biggest black kingpin.
It was then that the authorities began to take a closer interest in him. The investigation. Las Vegas was a location where Frank Matthews frequently visited. Like many drug dealers, he loved the city that had legalized gambling. Frank went there to gamble, to enjoy himself, but also to launder his money. As prosecutor William Callahan notes,
We heard Frank would bring duffel bags filled with cash to a casino and hand them to a cashier. The casino would take 15 to 18% for laundering his money.
the peculiar thing was that the authorities didn't even have him on their radar.
Frank Matthews had illegally built his fortune and risen to the pinnacle of the underworld, and nobody in law enforcement seemed aware of it. In 1970, Matthews' name didn't appear on any of the major criminal violators lists maintained by the authorities. He was a non-entity.
In fact, it wasn't until shortly after the Las Vegas summit in 1972 that the police finally began tapping his phone. It was the investigative group known as Group 12 that seriously examined his case. Its objective: to find a method to indict drug kingpin Frank Matthews. The investigators included William Callahan, whose responsibility was to coordinate the investigation, and Gerard Miller, a DEA agent with 20 years of experience in organized crime. Group 12 needed to gather all the evidence they could to prove that Matthews was involved in drug trafficking. Not an easy task, considering that Frank's only criminal record was for stealing chickens. Besides, Gerard Miller couldn't comprehend how such an influential drug trafficker had managed to evade police attention so far. And how could an African American in his 20s be involved in drug trafficking in almost 21 states of the country? It was a perplexing observation for the agents, including Miller, who said,
I hate to admit it, but Frank was ahead of us from the beginning.
The investigation was therefore not easy to conduct, especially as Group 12 was under considerable pressure from its superiors to produce results. And a shortage of resources available to carry out the investigation didn't help matters. The agents only had 3 months to produce something significant, which was very limited, especially to apprehend a gangster of Matthews' caliber. In reality, it would have required several years of investigation to achieve a convincing result. But Gerard Miller and his colleagues did their best with the resources at their disposal. It was thanks to them that Frank Matthews' telephone calls began to be intercepted. In 1972, the US anti-drug authorities then provided their support to the case, followed by Interpol and the US Tax Service, with whom Group 12 was collaborating closely to pursue the drug kingpin. Together, they succeeded in locating and seizing assets belonging to Frank, including several real estate properties. The investigators then attempted to follow his car whenever possible, but Frank was faster than them and always escaped, breaking every conceivable traffic rule. Frank was probably under the influence of cocaine during these chases. Or did he know in advance that he was being monitored? Corruption was widespread in the NYPD at the time. Either way, it wasn't worth continuing for Gerard Miller, who explains,
"It didn't really matter. We knew it was pointless to follow him. He didn't seem to fear anything. He once opened the trunk of his car in broad daylight, removed kilograms of drugs, and handed them to an individual in plain view of everyone."
As if Frank Matthews didn't care about law enforcement surveillance. But it was only a matter of time before things shifted in the investigators' favor. The arrest. In the early 70s, Frank Matthews' network continued to supply the United States with illegal substances and generate millions of dollars in revenue. Group 12's investigation progressed to the point where it caused the first damage to the drug kingpin's empire. It began with the arrest of several of his associates. The arrests followed one another over time, with people occasionally cooperating, giving Group 12 more and more evidence to strengthen their case. After a year's investigation, the authorities finally had solid evidence to bring down Frank Matthews. All that remained was to arrest him. The arrest occurred at 11 a.m. on 5th January 1973. Frank was at Las Vegas International Airport with his girlfriend, flying to Los Angeles, when the authorities intercepted him to place him in handcuffs. Shortly after, they had obtained an arrest warrant for tax fraud and conspiracy to traffic drugs. Matthews had attempted, between April and September 1972, to sell 18 kilograms of cocaine in Miami, with an estimated value between $1 and $4.5 million. So drug kingpin Frank Matthews was finally arrested. All that remained was to await his trial, scheduled for 7 months later. At the bail hearing, which occurred the day following his arrest, Frank displayed a certain arrogance toward William Callahan.
We were literally face to face. He told us that we had nothing on him and that he would be released in no time.
The disappearance. Frank had regained his freedom and was once again leading his criminal organization. For the investigators, this made it difficult to monitor him before the trial. Police Inspector Roger Garay testifies, "We couldn't keep tabs on Matthews. We were stretched thin and simply didn't have the manpower to watch him 24/7. All we could do was hope and pray he would keep showing up in court." Hope was all the police had, because ultimately, there was nothing preventing Frank Matthews from taking his belongings and disappearing with his entire fortune. It must be said that he was facing a life sentence, and in any case, the heroin market was increasingly unstable due to the gradual dismantling of the French Connection. So, based on this reality, there was nothing stopping him from fleeing. And that's precisely what happened on 2nd July, 1973, when the accused Frank Larry Matthews never appeared for the trial that was supposed to send him to prison. The drug kingpin had vanished. Reggie Collins, a drug dealer at the time, claims he was one of the last friends Frank saw before he disappeared. It was 4 a.m. and we were at Flaps on 119th Street. Frank said he was leaving town and not coming back. I watched him drive away in a 1972 Ford Thunderbird. Black body, white top, never saw him again. Frank DEA offered a $20,000 reward to anyone who could help capture him. This was the highest reward since the one offered for John Dillinger in 1931. The authorities distributed thousands of wanted posters across the country, receiving numerous calls from people claiming to have seen the fugitive. Unfortunately, these leads went nowhere. The manhunt. But the hunt for Frank Matthews intensified, and the DEA searched the world for him, having no doubt they would capture him eventually. Glenn Chisholm, one of the investigators involved in the search, recalls.
It was the biggest manhunt in DEA history, so it was exciting to be part of the team, but it was frustrating as well. It appeared as if we had mountains of evidence, but as we moved forward, the leads seemed to vanish into thin air.
The investigators therefore hoped he wasn't there because it would have been virtually impossible to capture him. The investigation group responsible for finding Matthews received hundreds of leads from around the world. It was as if Matthews could be everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. Getting information from interviewees was also extremely difficult. As Glenn Chisholm reports, during the entire time I was involved with the investigation, I never interviewed anybody who actually knew anything about Frank's whereabouts. They would say, invariably, that if they knew where Frank was, they would not tell us because Frank was generous with his money. Strangely, nobody seemed willing to provide any information about Frank Matthews. The investigators therefore interviewed other people, such as Barbara Hinton, Matthews' former wife, with whom he had 3 children.
We interviewed Barbara at her liquor store. The store was sparsely stocked, and it didn't appear to be profitable. Barbara struck me as being bitter. I don't know if she was that way personally, or if she was upset that Frank had left her. In any case, we believe she didn't know anything.
Al Parrish, Glenn Chisholm's colleague on the Frank Matthews case, also shares his impressions of the interview with Barbara Hinton.
It didn't seem that Hinton had any recent contact with Matthews. What kind of man abandons his kids and doesn't appear again? Surely if he was alive, he would have stayed in contact with Barbara for the sake of the kids. I just didn't understand it.
In any case, the investigators continued their work, which brings us to January 28th, 1974, the day Glenn Chisholm and Al Parrish went to Madison Square Garden in New York to watch the second fight between Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier. The objective was to catch Frank Matthews, a devoted Muhammad Ali fan. The 2 investigators had been informed that Frank had undergone cosmetic surgery to modify his features and thus remain incognito. Glenn Chisholm recalls,
I was really excited. I was going to an Ali Frazier fight and catch a big fugitive too. The experience was really something for a young agent like me.
That day, at least 20,000 people attended the legendary fight. The agents arrived early to observe the crowd, attempted to take photographs, but nothing, not a single sign of Frank Matthews. It was another failure. Dead or alive? A year passes, and the investigation group, which includes Glenn Chisholm and Al Parrish, has not made one bit of progress. It turns out that the investigators had spent an enormous amount of time searching for clues, examining every piece of evidence, traveling across the United States and abroad to follow up potential leads, and ultimately had achieved very little. In the end, they knew as much about Matthews' disappearance as they did at the start. A status quo that prompted the DEA to disband the investigation group. We felt like we had wasted our time and had gotten nowhere. The DEA didn't have its act together. The investigation was then handed over to the US Marshals, who took up the case from the beginning. Given the scarcity of information on the fugitive, but here too, as time went on, leads became increasingly rare. The DEA, which had kept the Matthews file open and continued the search, then saw a new generation of agents arrive in the following decades who certainly knew Frank but had other priorities. This was a time when major drug traffickers in Colombia and Mexico were monopolizing all the attention of the American authorities, and the Frank Matthews case was no longer the DEA's priority. The US Marshals continued to search, then examined more closely the 3 sons Frank had left behind. That's when they learned that one of them was in prison for stealing cars. This was surprising, as Frank was known to be a good father, but to go from a caring father to a neglectful one was strange. A suspicion shared by Mike Pizzi, who states,
If Matthews had $20 million when he left and he was still alive, what was his son doing stealing cars? I didn't feel that Frank had reached out to his family since he disappeared.
Had he deliberately cut himself off from those closest to him to ensure an effective escape? If so, it was surprising. What if, after all, Frank Matthews was dead? Of course, no fingerprints or traces of his body have been discovered, but there are theories that point in that direction. Many people interviewed by the investigators have said that Frank Matthews is no longer with us. Deborah Nightwine, a member of the U.S. Marshal Service, seems to share this opinion. The Matthews investigation was the most frustrating case I ever worked. I literally worked the case 24/7. I followed through on every lead. By the end of the assignment, I began thinking that maybe the reason I didn't find anything solid was because Frank Matthews was dead. Mike Peasy also believes in this hypothesis. Being the ultimate optimist, I originally believed we could find and arrest him. My deputies and I worked many cases where the investigation took us far and wide. Usually, we had a piece of information or a lead that was solid, even in cases where the fugitive was a month ahead of us, or a state or county away from the last sighting, or the last verifiable piece of information. But I don't recall a case from the past 40 or more years that involves a fugitive fleeing with a young girlfriend and both of them disappearing without a trace. A plausible theory in the sense that Frank didn't like the mafia, and the mafia didn't like him either. First of all, we know that some New York mobsters didn't appreciate Frank moving to Tot Hill. As Gerard Miller explains,
We know the mob was really upset with Frank's presence in Tot Hill.
We learned that the mob sent a delegation to see Frank and tell him he was out of his league.
La Cosa Nostra, in fact, was so upset that Group 12 even began to receive anonymous intelligence from sources living across the street from the Matthews residence.